Okay, well, I think we might get started. Hello and welcome to this La Trobe Asia launch of our 6th La Trobe Asia Policy Brief, Fresh Perspectives on the Indo-Pacific. My name is Beck Strading. I'm the Director of La Trobe Asia at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. And I would like to begin the event by acknowledging the elders of the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which La Trobe University sits. And I would like to pay respect to their people, both past and present, and extend that respect to any Indigenous Australians who are watching this webinar. And part of our role at La Trobe Asia is to engage the public in meaningful discussion and debate, and to deepen our knowledge and understanding of our region. Today's launch of the 6th La Trobe Asia Brief is a culmination of a program that we've run called Regional Perspectives on the Free and Open Indo-Pacific. And we have been running this program with the support of the US Embassy and with Australian youth diplomacy organisations. And this is a program that has been designed for emerging leaders across Australia in the field of international affairs. And I'm delighted to say that the hard copy of the La Trobe Asia Brief has just come straight off the press. And if you would like a copy of this, you can feel free to email us at La Trobe Asia. It is also available in soft copy on the website. As part of the project, we have published 13 policy briefs on our La Trobe Asia website, and this hard copy features 8 of those contributions, and they're focusing on a range of topics and countries. So our Indo-Pacific emerging leaders have looked at critical issues facing the region, including the crisis in Myanmar, issues to do with ASEAN, women, peace, security, food security, the Pacific, and trade. And we've really sought to showcase some of the issues that emerging leaders consider to be the most pressing in the Indo-Pacific and potential solutions for addressing these issues. So you can find additional articles on our website that look at topics such as AUKUS, democracy in the region, and Asian language literacy. La Trobe Asia is thankful to the US Embassy in Canberra for their support of the Indo-Pacific Emerging Leaders Dialogue. So the brief and tonight's event provides an insight into the fresh perspectives on the Indo-Pacific, offering some thoughts into policy thinking of next generation Australian leaders. And today's launch of the La Trobe Asia Brief features 3 of our fantastic contributors, and I'm really pleased to have the 3 contributors joining me today. First up, we have Tom Barber, who is a program officer with the Asia Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue, and a good friend of La Trobe Asia, has been engaged with us for a long period of time. Tom has a keen interest in Australia's international affairs, previously working as a research assistant at Deakin University and with us at La Trobe Asia, and has been published in the Lowy Institute's Interpreter. Welcome, Tom. We are also joined by Isadora Vadaz, who works in criminal law policy for the Victorian Department of Justice and Community Safety. She holds a Master of Law and Development and has studied and worked on the intersection of law, gender and conflict, and spent contributing to criminal justice projects in Myanmar and Cambodia. Welcome, Isadora. Last but certainly not least, we have Alexander M. Hind, who is a PhD candidate in international relations at the University of New South Wales and a research associate at UNSW's Korea Research Initiatives. He is also a senior research analyst at one of South Korea's top 10 law firms and a book review editor at the Journal of Territorial and Maritime Studies. Welcome, Alexander. Now, the way that we are going to run today's event is each of our panelists will have 10 minutes or so to present on their paper, and then we're going to open it up for question and answer. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box as we go along. But I'm going to invite Tom to kick off the presentations. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Beck. I'd like to also acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the East Kulin Nation and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging too. Thanks to Trobe Asia and all the partners, and thanks to the US Embassy for making this Emerging Leaders program possible. So my paper deals with diplomatic investment and Australia's diplomatic capacity, and I'd like to begin with a couple of figures. So a recent ASPI report by former Ambassador James Wise shows that DFAT's budget has shrunken by 9% in real terms since the turn of the century. Over the same period, the defence budget has increased by 122% in real terms. So as a percentage of GDP, that's 0.3% compared to 2.1%, or a sevenfold difference. These figures might not come as a surprise to many of the people tuning in. You know, the idea that Australia has under-resourced DFAT isn't a new one. A number of high-profile foreign policy experts, former practitioners, including a few former DFAT secretaries, have been vocal in pointing out what they see as the worsening state of Australian diplomatic investment. But diplomacy is rarely a high public priority in Australia. When it does crop up, it's often topic or event specific and can be refracted through a domestic lens. So the political incentives to increase diplomatic funding haven't really been there. And thoughtful debate on Australia's place in the world doesn't really happen in a mainstream sense. So drawing attention to the negative consequences of successive cuts to diplomacies has really only been the purview of specialists or people who are really focused on trying to look at that particular topic. This appears to be changing. So AUKUS is a prominent example. There's been plenty written about France having been caught off guard with the announcement and criticism of it as lacking detail and being more style than substance. You know, France is an important Indo-Pacific power that Australia was trying to forge closer ties with, but it's since removed us from their list of close strategic partners as a consequence. So I guess on that point, diplomacy is like a muscle. If it's not adequately exercised, not adequately nourished, then it can atrophy. Other examples in recent years include the decision not to renew the domestic manufacturing of COVID vaccines that our region could really benefit from, the floating of the idea to move the Australian embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, the SNAP export ban on cattle to Indonesia. These are all notable cases that have been cited as diplomatic fails, if you like. It's impossible to prove counterfactual, but you know, a lot of people have pointed out that these kind of missteps could have been avoided had DFAT been more adequately resourced and consulted. So as Australia's circumstances have sharply changed, concerning trends have been accelerated by COVID, we're now in a much more contested environment. Our outlook is no longer so benign, and I think there's a reflexive tendency towards overreaction because of that. We've had a comfortable strategic environment for so long, a great and powerful friend, like from the beginning of settlement in Australia, that, you know, now that everything's changing, I think it shows that complacency has kind of led to reactionism when the situation isn't so easy. I think we've skipped ahead of a step as a nation. We've turbocharged our defence capability, but left diplomacy to kind of languish at a time when I think it's needed the most in difficult times. You know, Scott Morrison recently announced $38 billion in additional defence spending, and in justifying it, he said that you can't flick a switch to increase your Army, Navy and Air Force overnight. Growing the type of people and skills we need to face the threats of the future takes time. So we must start now so critical skills can be taught and experience gained. So he was talking about defence there, but I'd argue that this exact same could be said of diplomacy. You know, diplomats don't grow on trees. You need to invest long term to get that capability up to speed. So on the additional defence spending, you know, not every problem is a nail. A well-funded diplomatic corps is more agile, it's more deployable, it's more able to respond to a much wider range of problems and challenges than defence is. The hammer of defence, some would call it, which only has one core kind of warfighting deterrence function. There's things that defence logistics can help with in terms of non-traditional threats, I guess. So like with climate change, logistics can help with the symptoms such as ADF's Operation Bushfire Assist, but it can't help with the root causes, like a diplomatic effort such as the Conference of Parties is configured to do. It's not to say we shouldn't invest in defence. I think we should, and I think we need to. You just look at Russia and Ukraine in the last few weeks, and it shows that the international orders, it's a lot less benign than it was just a decade ago. The era of US unipolarity is well and truly over, and it is a more dangerous world. But defence investment should be in addition to, not at the expense of diplomacy. I don't pretend to have all the answers here. It's a tough calculus, juggling different priorities with finite resources. But I'd argue that it makes sense to utilise all the elements of statecraft at your disposal, even more so in challenging times. It's the logic of don't put all your eggs in one basket, diversify risk, that type of thing. So how should we proceed from here? So I write in the article about the UK integrated review, which I think is a good place to start. So what is that? Essentially, it's a distillation of UK foreign policy and defence white paper and the defence white paper into a single summary document. It notes the overlap and interaction between broad trends, outlines the UK's national security and foreign policy objectives in response to those trends, and really underscores the benefits of a more coherent and integrated approach to achieve their stated goals. It's less an attempt to prescribe specific policies on every issue, more of an outlining of a national narrative that sets a foreign policy baseline and really identifies those priority actions that can kind of guide statecraft as a whole. The process here is what's key. And an Australian integrated review, I think, would help to draw out national priorities and allocate resources to them in a dispassionate way. There's value in bringing together the distinct elements of statecraft in order to break down silos, coordinate strategies, and optimise resources. Alignment, it's not simply the addition of capabilities. It can be a force multiplier if done right. And the whole can be greater than the sum of its parts, with each arm of statecraft complementing the others. So as this La Trobe Asia program was happening last year, I actually saw an advertisement for a job with a new initiative, the Asia Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue, AP4D. And that initiative seeks to do just that, break down silos, foster a more integrated approach to Australian foreign policy, and build a 3D constituency, 3D being development, diplomacy and defence. So I applied for the role and was successful. So I'm in the privileged position now to be working on the same issues that I wrote about for this piece. And so, it's really interesting topic. So if you want to learn more, you can check out our work on what an integrated approach to Australian foreign policy looks like in practice in Southeast Asia on our website, asiapacific4d.com. But just to finish up, I'm not advocating for diplomacy over defence. Both are needed, I think, clearly. It's about getting the balance right in order to optimise finite resources, leverage the strengths of each of the arms of statecraft and really maximise Australia's room for foreign policy manoeuvre. There's no easy answers, but the more options we keep open to us, the better prepared we will be moving ahead. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Tom. Asia Pacific 4D are certainly very lucky to have you on the team. Now, just before we get to our second speaker, Isadora, I did want to just pop in a quick question to you, Tom. We are in an election year. It shouldn't be too far away. Do you think that we are headed towards a khaki election? And do you think that diplomacy and aid are likely to get a look in this year's federal election?
That's a good question. Look, I think it's pretty clear that it is looking like a khaki election. The Morrison government is really trying to, it seems, differentiate itself from the ALP on defence and national security. The opposition, for its parts, kind of trying to say that national security should be above partisan politics, and there's been a bit of back and forth on that recently. Whether or not bipartisanship on national security is an intrinsically good thing or not, that's another matter. There's a good piece by Richard Maud recently in Lowy that kind of goes through the pros and cons of that. But aside from rhetorical differences. The substance, I think, is quite similar between the parties. On things like AUKUS, the Quad, the US alliance, there's really no substantive differences there. On China, for example, I think Elena Collinson has a great piece out that shows pretty much complete policy consensus on 16 key issues across that. I think the focus on national security is somewhat overshadowing a growing recognition on both sides of the importance of all of the elements of statecraft, be it development, diplomacy, or defence. It's a positive trend, I think, that consensus is kind of building. Recent articulations by both sides have kind of speak to that. So Scott Morrison's talked about using all of elements of statecraft. Maurice Payne's talked about the importance of a whole of government approach. The Minister for International Development said that Australia needs to leverage all tools of statecraft. And it's the same with the ALP. Anthony Albanese's spoken about how he wants to rebuild diplomatic service and revitalise the aid program. Penny Wong's talked about how statecraft is greater than the sum of its parts. And Pat Conroy's also outlined the need for more coordination and joined up thinking in Australian foreign policy. So it's hard to say concrete commitments before the budget next week, which hopefully we'll get a bit more of a concrete idea on policies and things like that. But Labor seems to have committed in his speech to Lowy Institute last week. Albanese said that Labor would reverse the marginalisation that had occurred in DFAT. The government's announcements recently have been more focused on national security, but as I said just before, there is at least a recognition that they've outlined and articulated that is encouraging in terms of hopefully getting a bit more funding for diplomacy and development. So I think it's a positive trend, better than nothing. It remains to be seen what will happen, but yeah, let's see.
Thank you, Tom. And now I'm going to hand the virtual microphone over to Isadora. Thank you.
Thanks, Beck. Hi, everybody. I'm super thrilled to be here to talk a little bit about my article, Supporting Gender Inclusive Conflict Resolution, which is about what Australia can do to support inclusive transitions to democracy from conflict in the Indo-Pacific region. So I wanted to start off by giving a little bit of an overview of some of the central principles of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So the sort of foundational document of the agenda is UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which essentially emphasizes that conflicts are highly gendered. And despite the fact that peace processes and politics in general have historically been characteristically masculine spaces, this undermines the impact that conflict has on women and ignores the effect that that women's inclusion can have on sustainable peace. So the agenda emphasizes that civilian women are often the most adversely affected by conflict, and also that women's empowerment plays a huge role in sustainable peace, because there is a really strong link between gender equality and social equality in general and peace. So equality is a really strong underpinner of peaceful societies. A study of 156 peace agreements worldwide showed that when women are included in peace processes, agreements are 35% more likely to last at least 15 years. And when conflict is at stake, I think those numbers are really important. So in my article, I begin by discussing the peace process in Cambodia in the 90s. So in 2019, I had the privilege of working for an NGO called NGO CEDAW that worked in women's empowerment, and it was chaired by Dr. Pung Chib Kek, who was the only woman involved, even remotely, in Cambodia's peace process. So she wasn't invited to the official negotiations, but she was a really key player in getting some of the figures of the conflict to actually begin dialogues. She's an incredibly impressive woman and also Cambodia's first female doctor. So Unfortunately, that peace process was not at all gender inclusive. And I would argue that has something to do with the fact that Cambodia suffers from high levels of inequality today, because the really transformative effect of including women and issues of gender in that peace process was not, that opportunity was not taken. So I asked what Australia can do to support more inclusive and sustainable peace in the Indo-Pacific, looking specifically at the ongoing situation in Myanmar that's been unfolding, in particular the situation that's been unfolding since last year. So knowing that there is a causal relationship between inequality and violent conflict, obviously the situation in Myanmar occurs against a really complex backdrop of ethnic, linguistic, and other conflict, and quite high levels of gender inequality. There are really significant gendered elements of the conflict. We know that the Myanmar military is a highly patriarchal organization, and we've seen from some of the media reports that the sort of civil disobedience movement in Myanmar has had really significant gendered elements. Like, for example, I think about 60% of the protesters when they began in the beginning of 2021 were women. So I think that Australia can support this really crucial groundwork that's happening in Myanmar, and support a peace process in the future, whenever that may occur, that's inclusive and also really long lasting. So Australia has a national action plan on gender, peace and security. And that recognises that women's empowerment can have a disruptive effect on cycles of conflict. And I think this is particularly relevant for the situation in Myanmar, which has experienced conflicts in one form or another for many decades now. I recommended that Australia build on their really robust tradition of promoting peace and democracy, such as their involvement in the peace process in Cambodia, and demonstrate its commitment to an inclusive and peaceful Indo-Pacific region by supporting inclusive peace in Myanmar. So my recommendation for that would be to support the really strong civil society organisations that are already active in Myanmar, who will be really key to achieving the goal of an inclusive peace in the future. Women-led civil society is already really active in Myanmar and providing peace building and humanitarian services. And Australia can provide financial and technical support to ensure that these organisations can continue and grow their operations, because we know that even if it's a sort of long-term goal, increasing gender equality in Myanmar will go a long way towards an inclusive and long-lasting peace in the future. Technical support could also come in the form of providing training or finance for training, so that women have the skills to be able to participate or mediate a future peace process. And the aim of this is to promote gender equality, because as I mentioned, it really does underpin a peaceful society. And also a peace process with women's inclusion is more likely to create the foundations for the greater inclusion of women in society post-conflict. Women's direct inclusion and influence, as I mentioned, in peace processes can really help reduce gender-based violence, enhance gender equality, diffuse conflict, and lead to a more sustainable peace. Because when women have the opportunity to influence peace processes, they frequently broaden the set of issues at the negotiating table beyond just the direct parties of the conflict, to address development and human rights issues, as well as security, and really be able to shape the form and structure of the society post-conflict. So to finish up the article, I returned back to the story of Dr. Keck, who recently said in an interview that she really wishes that her nation could enjoy long, true peace. And I think that Australia could use that example to promote a really stable and conflict-free Indo-Pacific region by ensuring that women's voices are heard and incorporated into peace processes.
Thank you so much. And just before we hear from Alexander, I just wanted to, I mean, your article, it really does tell this fascinating story, and it's very much about peace processes in Myanmar and what Australia can contribute. But I'm wondering if we can zoom out for a minute and think about what are the next steps for implementing the Women, Peace, Security agenda in the Indo-Pacific beyond peace process is obviously a really important part of that, but there are other things that need to happen in the region. So I'm wondering about your views on that.
Yeah, I think that there are really a lot of options for what countries in the Indo-Pacific can do. I think that sound policy always has to come from a strong evidence base. So I think developing a really strong understanding by collecting data on the gendered nature of conflicts in each country is a really important place to start, so that any policy action can be tailored to the demographic and also the actual nature of the conflict or conflict-free society, whichever case. I think an important next step after that is to develop a national action plan. So the Women, Peace and Security agenda asks each country to develop a national action plan. Australia is sadly one of very few countries in the Indo-Pacific that has one, others being Bangladesh, Indonesia, Japan, Nepal, Philippines, New Zealand, and a couple of others. I think Australia is in a really strong position to be able to support neighbouring countries to develop these national action plans, considering we've developed 2 now, and I think we have really strong expertise in this area and some leading experts in the field. So I think regardless of whether a country is experiencing conflict or not, it's really important to have a national action plan in place to guide responses to conflict and even other security issues like extreme weather events. And I think more knowledge sharing amongst countries that have experienced conflict or are in a position to be able to support others is also really crucial in this space. Because, I mean, I'm sure not every country expects to be experiencing conflict, but in the case that was to occur, I think our countries in the Indo-Pacific have a wealth of experience to be able to share and learn and be able to teach other countries about.
Thank you very much. And last but certainly not least, Alexander.
Thanks, Beck. So I would also like to start my remarks by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Torres Strait Islander people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm talking to you from today, and by paying my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are in the audience here today. And I should also, before I forget, I should also say thank you to the La Trobe Asia team for organising this event, and also for the programme at the end of last year, which I was fortunate enough to attend, which I think was really useful and a brilliant opportunity for everyone involved. So thank you very much. My paper was about South Korea's maritime security, and my basic argument is that South Korea needs a naval strategy and mission that's better aligned with its regional priorities. But before I make that argument, 2 important points I want to make just for context. Firstly, South Korea and discussions of South Korean maritime security often start by acknowledging that South Korea functions as a kind of geostrategic island because it's sealed off from the rest of continental Asia along the inter-Korean border. And while this term geostrategic island maybe downplays the degrees to which the border has at times been fairly porous over the last 25 years in terms of inter-Korean relations, nevertheless, the term geostrategic island as applied to South Korea does tell us something quite useful, I think, about South Korea's reliance upon sea lines of communication and a rules-based maritime order for its economic and security needs over the last 70 years. The second point I want to make is that a lot of South Korea's naval development and strategic development over the last 30 years has been enabled by a very strong maritime history culture, which really kind of shapes the way this development has taken place. So we can talk about historical figures like Jang Bo-go or Lee Sun-shin and how they're memorialized in the contemporary South Korean state, which you can see just in simple facts like how South Korea names its naval platforms and types of platform. And you can also see it in terms of the engagement with the domestic audience. So if you go to Seoul and you walk along the Han River in central Seoul, since 2017, there's been something called the Battleship Park, right? Where you can see this decommissioned South Korean frigate parked up along the side of the main river in Seoul, that you can go on and learn about South Korea's maritime history and culture and naval development. And that's really important to acknowledge, because without that, the substantial investment in naval platforms over the last couple of generations in South Korea simply wouldn't have been able to take place. So if I move on to talking just very broadly about South Korea's maritime interests, we can talk really about two types, although of course they overlap. But these types are, firstly, if we think about South Korea's maritime interests in Northeast Asia, obviously we have the threat posed by North Korea, especially in waters to the west of the peninsula. But we also have real competition with other regional navies, most notably Japan and China, with a range of disputed maritime boundaries and territories and overlapping air defense identification zones, which in recent years have led to a number of clashes or very near misses between these different forces. So obviously these are South Korea's primary interests, but within the last 30 years, you have seen this development of a range of broader regional or blue water interests, most notably protecting South Korea's shipping from piracy and other threats, war zone evacuations, and humanitarian aid and disaster relief. So really, the issue for South Korea is how it's sought to balance and complement these different interests in terms of how it's developed its navy. So this naval modernization, which has required substantial material investment in South Korea, has emerged in this post-Cold War period. And I guess the question is, why has it emerged after the Cold War? Well, I've already talked about this expanding range of interests, especially at the regional level. We can talk about South Korea's desire for autonomy within the US alliance. And I think we should also mention the important role of status and South Korea's desire to demonstrate its status. Definitely, if we think about some of the larger platforms that have been more controversially under consideration, like the light aircraft carrier, definitely because naval platforms are so capital intensive, there is an element of status there as well. So in line with this kind of expanding range of interests, South Korea has developed this range of blue water platforms that are able to play a role, importantly, in both peninsular and blue water strategy. An example would be something like the Aegis-equipped KDX-3 destroyer, which has a role both around the peninsula and more broadly. And one of the roles it has is in what's called the Changhae unit, which has been a South Korean naval task force deployed continuously since 2009 off the coast of Africa to deal with maritime piracy as part of this multilateral anti-piracy deployment. So the problem for South Korea is that this Changhae unit has been there now since 2009, so what's that, 13 years, and in the most recent data that we've had, piracy has actually gone down a lot in this area. So there's a real question now of, okay, is this resource, this substantial investment of South Korea's naval resources off the coast of Africa, the real peripheries of the Indo-Pacific region, is this going to go on indefinitely, or are these resources going to be deployed somewhere that's more essential to South Korea's broader regional strategy? So moving on to South Korea's regional policy, I should say first off that South Korea, unlike Australia maybe, has been really reluctant to join the US-led Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy, or indeed the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and instead has tried to maximize its own autonomy while still engaging with other regional perspectives and other regional strategies. So one of the current president, Moon Jae-in's key policy initiatives since 2017 has been the New Southern Policy, which has attempted to expand relations with ASEAN states and India. As I say, we're also seeking opportunities for collaboration with regional strategies. So this New Southern Policy has 3 pillars, or known as the 3 Ps: people, prosperity, and peace. And while the assessments of this policy, which has now basically run its course because of the recent election, there have been, mixed. There's a mixed record of this New Southern Policy in terms of the assessments that are given of it. But one area of broad consensus, I think, is that out of the 3 pillars, the least developed of these pillars has been the peace pillar, which is related more to issues of security. So, as many of you will know, President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol, there was a presidential election in South Korea about 2 weeks ago, and the new president is very much opposed to the previous president, and this new president-elect, Yoon Suk-yeol, will take office, we think, around May 10th. And just like previous presidents, it's highly likely that he'll seek to define his regional policy, and indeed many policies, in opposition to his predecessor. So in my view, one way that he could do this very fruitfully is by emphasizing the peace or the security element of South Korea's regional policy going forward. And this doesn't mean necessarily that Seoul should or indeed would consider a role in some of the more controversial elements of regional maritime security, like the US freedom of navigation operations. But instead, in my view, South Korea needs to start playing a larger role in boosting the naval capabilities and capacity of its partners, especially in Southeast Asia. So I'm talking about things like providing more of the training and equipment necessary to create a greater balance between the region's naval forces. At the same time, it's important to note that South Korea has, although it's invested a lot of money, a lot of resources into this naval development over the last 30 years, it still trails behind other regional navies like China and Japan. So, as I say, going forward, it's still really important to invest in more versatile platforms that can be used both around the peninsula and as part of its blue water mission. A good example of this, of maybe what not to invest in, controversially for South Korea, is that Japan, China, the US, Russia, all these navies have like hospital ships, which have a very explicit humanitarian aid and disaster relief mission. And for South Korea, although I argue that it should invest in humanitarian aid and disaster relief, by choosing a platform that has only a single use, it really limits itself in how it responds to different situations that may or may not develop in the region going forward. So, as final point I'll make is that as the South Korean Navy continues to mature, it's going to experience some interesting things which it hasn't really had to consider before. A good example of this is decommissioned naval platforms. So South Korea has been boosting its Navy for the last 30 years, and a lot of these kind of initial investments will soon be up for decommission because they're too old. So the question is what to do with these decommissioned ships. I gave you the example earlier of ships that are being used in order to shape domestic public opinion in South Korea itself, which is really important if South Korea is going to continue to make the kind of substantial investments to its Navy over the long term, which it has done for the last 30 years. Another example which South Korea has already started doing is donating old patrol and frigate ships to Southeast Asian partners. There was recently news about, I believe, the Philippines. So much like Australia does with its old ships, it's really important here to have like a long-term process where not only the platforms, but also the training and kind of ongoing support is provided over a longer period of time. And I think a lot of these things are still being considered in Seoul. So I will stop my remarks there, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexander. A fascinating topic. We do have some questions in the Q&A box. Please feel free to put your questions in there. Before we get to the audience Q&A though, Alexander, your PhD research looks at middle power identity formation. So I wouldn't mind asking you at this point, what is the role of middle powers in the Indo-Pacific region during times of strategic contestation? And I was wondering, when you were speaking, you're talking about, you know, South Korea could play a bigger role in capacity building in Southeast Asia. Australia could too. Are there opportunities for middle powers to work together in regional maritime security cooperation?
Sure. So the first thing I would say is that middle powers in general, in terms of their strategy, focusing on the regional level is a really good idea, because for middle powers, they don't have the capacities to be able to influence every area of the world, obviously, like perhaps great powers would. So pitching your foreign policy at the regional level is something that I think is really important, not only for South Korea, but also for other regional middle powers. And of course, middle powers tend to be very open to cooperation. So these kind of multilateral initiatives are very appealing to a lot of these states. But having said that, I wouldn't say that there's necessarily a single role for middle powers. And in fact, what we can see in some of the regions self-identifying middle powers is that they have taken on quite drastically different roles over the last 5-10 years. My friend at Sydney University, Dr. Gabriel Abundanza, had an article out last week, I think, in International Affairs, where he looks at the 3 key middle powers in the Indo-Pacific region, being Australia, South Korea, and Indonesia, and basically outlines their roles as Australia being very committed to its alignment with the US, I think certainly since 2017, South Korea being very cautious about its role, and Indonesia being very kind of skeptical and more neutralist. I think we're going to see a bit of a shift now that South Korea has a more conservative president going forward from May. But I still think South Korea has a lot of structural forces that mean it's impossible for South Korea, or very difficult for South Korea, to fully get on board with the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. For South Korea, China is still the #1 trading partner, and South Korea is still very kind of geographically proximate to China. So that's obviously different from Australia's geographic position, right? So, you know, on the one hand, we can say that all these states are very cooperative, and they're likely to have a really important impact and role in shaping the regional order as we go forward. But I don't necessarily think that they're going to have this kind of uniform approach to the region.
Thank you. Well, we might get to Q&A, and there's a comment and a question for you, Tom. So the comment is that in your review of statecraft and diplomatic reach, there's a recommendation that we don't restrict ourselves to traditional methods, and it's worth checking out how the French handle commercial diplomacy as an example. So you might want to respond to that. But there is also another question from Tom Corbin from the US Studies Center. Hi, Tom. He is in wholehearted agreement with you on the need to fund diplomacy alongside defence and other tools of statecraft. However, he's interested in any thoughts you might have about where that resourcing should come from, given that budgets are finite. Do defence dollars need to be repurposed for DFAT? Is this primarily about getting spending priorities right within defence, or can funding be shifted from other portfolios? I think this is a central question for thinking about how Australia manages its international affairs, certainly linked in with what Alexander was talking about, being a middle power. Being a middle power means that there are limited resources. So Tom, you have a response to those comments and questions?
Yeah, thanks, Beck, and thanks to Tom and the other question asker. I'll do the first one quickly and then the second one. So I'm not super familiar with like French commercial diplomacy, but I totally agree that, you know, there's other methods that could definitely add value to how Australia conducts its own diplomacy. You know, whether it be, you know, feminist foreign policy can make a big contribution, or Indigenous knowledge, like for example, with AP4D at the moment, we've started our Pacific program, and there's a lot of talk on how Pan-Pacific Indigenous linkages can really contribute in terms of negotiation, traditional knowledge, that type of thing. So, you know, I'm not a subject matter expert in any of those by any stretch, but I think the key is to provide platforms for voices, different voices, diverse voices that might not otherwise be heard, as well as bringing together people to talk, have dialogues, discuss different ideas, because then you really get the value out of all the different perspectives. So as for Tom's question, look, to be honest, I haven't looked a whole lot into the question of where that extra funding should come from, what should be rearranged, that type of thing. I guess the angle I was coming from was more in terms of getting the process right to begin with before we start allocating the funding. So, you know, I think it's key, like I talked about the UK integrated review style thing that could be undertaken, and it's key to have that, so you have that guiding foundation that can ensure coherence. That will then organically help with prioritising, because there'll be a clear national strategic narrative, I guess, or outline of what we need to do, and just getting that conversation going to outline what needs to be done and how we can get there. So for example, I think the latest Lowy poll, or maybe the one beforehand, the top 5 threats identified were like droughts, pandemics, the global economic downturn, climate change, and environment. And, you know, none of those really can be fixed with more military hardware. So military defense can be handy for some things, but not all. And if those are the top threats that people are identifying, I think there's definitely a case to be made that, you know, we should allocate funding towards the arms of statecraft that can better deal with those types of challenges. You get more bang for your buck with diplomacy. There's not those really large overriding legacy costs of having to maintain really expensive platforms or keep acquiring new ones to keep up with the trends, which also just accelerates security dilemmas. I mean, it's a tough question to answer how much you take, but yeah, I think it's really key is the process. Get the process right to determine what the priority should be, and then I think the funding side of things will kind of take care of itself. Also getting a bit of public debate on it too would be really key, because there's a bit of misperception out there of actually how much we do spend on diplomacy and development. I mentioned the Lowy poll before. Again, they've got some great data where I think it was the majority of participants thought that Australia spent about 15% of GDP on diplomacy and development, overseas aid. They thought that was too much, but they were happy to spend 10%. At the moment, we spend, I think it's 0.2%. So, you know, look, the appetite, I think, is there. It's just about getting that conversation started. And from there, you can move on to, you know, the reallocation of resources and things like that.
Thanks, Tom. There are a few questions for Isadora, so I'll turn to you now. The first question is about the extent to which female political representation is a key to success. If there are more female MPs, is there less likelihood of intra-national conflict? And the second one we have from Christian Wells. Given that large numbers of women have joined PDFs in the current conflict in Myanmar, and are also quite prevalent in ethnic militias such as the Arakan Army in the Rakhine State, do you think women will be more influential in any future conflict resolution efforts than they have been in the past? So over to you.
Thanks, Beck. They're very good questions. I'll do my best to answer them. I think in terms of female political representation and the effect that that has on the likelihood of countries resorting to aggressive conduct. I guess I would say that it's obviously very important to have representation of people of all genders in the political space, but it's obviously not a silver bullet. I tend to conceptualize of women's representation in the political sphere as being a right rather than a means to an end, because there's just absolutely no reason why people of different genders shouldn't have equal representation in government. I think at the same time, people tend to think that women will be more less likely to support violent conflict because of our historical conceptualization as carers, and men's role as the sort of strong defenders. But I think there's no real biological basis for this. And we see women represented across the entire political spectrum. So I don't think it's necessarily borne out that women politicians wouldn't support conflict. But I do think that a state with greater representation or equal representation of gender diverse people in government probably reflects high levels of equality in the society in general, and we know that countries that have a basis in gender equality are less likely to be aggressive to neighbours. So I think in that sense, it is really important to have female or diverse, gender diverse political leaders. And we've obviously seen, not that it's necessarily a conflict, despite some countries naming it as such, but yeah, definitely in the COVID response, I think we've seen countries with greater female political representation handling that in a very different way to some others, and yeah, you could say that that's been a more social, human-centered response, which is an interesting comparison. I hope that answers that question. I'll try to move on to the other one. So, do you think women will be more influential in any future conflict resolution efforts because of higher representation of women in PDFs? I don't think that would necessarily be the case. I think it takes a more concerted effort to translate more female fighters or soldiers into actual progress in a peace process or future conflict resolution efforts. I think it'd be really interesting to look at other countries that in which conflicts have had more sort of female combatants, such as countries in Latin America, like maybe Colombia. I know that's obviously a very, very different context, and it's really hard to compare Myanmar to other countries because it's such a unique and complex environment. But yeah, I think there would be a high risk that any gains made towards gender equality in a conflict situation would not be carried over in a post-conflict society. And I think, yeah, a very, very conscious effort has to be made to do so. Otherwise, the everyday, very patriarchal or patriarchal norms of a country like Myanmar with very strong traditional gender roles, I think we'd see a sort of snap back to that in the aftermath of a conflict. But yeah, it'd be really interesting to see what's happened in that space in other contexts.
Thank you for that set of responses. And Alexander, we have a couple for you as well. Any insight from you? You did briefly discussed the new Korean presidency, but any more insight on how that will view Korea's maritime borders as more or less Trumpian? And the second question is from Tom Corbin as well, sneaking in a second one there. The relationship between Korea's Navy and Japan's maritime self-defense force is generally considered quite robust, but Japan-Korea relations have hit new lows in recent years, and prospects for repairing the relationship seem quite dim, even with new leaders in Seoul and Tokyo. In this new political context, do you think the growth in South Korean naval power is likely to produce greater or lesser stability in its relationship with Japan in the coming years? So I guess those two questions are related. And over to you, Alexander.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think maybe I'll start with the second one. I'm not sure about Trumpian maritime borders, but so I'll start with the second one. I think the simple answer is I don't think that either by having strengthening South Korea's maritime capabilities or platform numbers, I don't think that necessarily has any impact in terms of the stability or instability of Japan-Korea relations on its own. For me, it's all about how those material factors are shaped by how the politics plays out over the next administration. So we could say, if we look back, as I think Tom mentioned, like South Korea's relationship or South Korea's naval relationship with the Japanese Navy has been fairly strong in some instances, and how they've interacted at sea has often been really positive. So if we look back to the interactions between their ADIZs, their air defense identification zones, for example, there's been a lot more cooperation in terms of informing each other before they enter each other's air defense identification zone, and vice versa. So it hasn't become this issue in many ways that they've had with China and other regional actors, Russia, over the last 10 years. But at the same time, there have been a number of flare-ups, and definitely there are issues that involve South Korea's Navy for which South Korea is prepared to demonstrate extreme resolve. I'm thinking of an incident a few years ago where there was an exchange of fire in aircraft above Dr. Takeshima, the disputed island between South Korea and Japan. There have also been incidents like during a joint maritime event where South Korea was upset of Japan flying a particular flag, the Rising Sun flag. So I think really a lot of it depends on the politics of how that plays out in the next 5 years. Hopefully we won't have a repeat of things like inflammatory actions like visiting disputed islands and or certain other statements which really haven't helped in the last 10 years. But for me, yes, I think there's opportunities for cooperation. I ended my talk by talking about the potential for humanitarian aid and disaster relief, especially in Southeast Asia. I think one of the really sad things about this region that we're part of is the extreme vulnerability that we have to natural disasters and extreme weather events. But in terms of naval cooperation, it's also in a very perverse way kind of an opportunity for cooperation, because it's likely that there will be these extreme weather events or natural disasters within the next 10 years. And I think that's a real opportunity for the regional navies to demonstrate their ability to cooperate. So I think, yes, definitely more naval platforms or more capabilities will enable that kind of broader cooperation away from Northeast Asia, especially in a kind of broader regional framework. But as I say, for me, the important thing is the politics that kind of that influences how those interactions at sea are going to be shaped over the next 5 years. In terms of the new president and his approach to maritime borders, well, gosh, so of course, President-elect Yoon has taken a somewhat more hardline approach to North Korea's security. and there's certain considerations being made at the moment about the agreement made back in 2018 about how they control that border zone and prevent clashes. There's been a clash within the last 2 weeks, I believe, of North Korean naval ships kind of going over the disputed line to the west of the peninsula. So I don't expect that to change. I would say, in terms of, I'm not sure the Trumpian element of that question, but in terms of the number of escapees or people who have left North Korea to get to South Korea, that number has really dropped off, partly because of COVID and the way that North Korea has responded to that by really trying to seal shut the borders. But one way that immigration has happened from North Korea to the south has been via the sea, and that has been like very important over the last 10 years in terms of like shaping their interactions. So I don't know whether President Yoon will have a stronger response or not. He's signaled over the last couple of days that he's not going to get rid of the Ministry of Unification, which had been kind of hinted at over the last few months, and that's not now going to happen. But instead, it's going to be apparently empowered to kind of play a broader role than it did maybe in the Moon administration. So we'll see how that plays out. But I think in many ways it's too early to tell. Things are not going great in terms of inter-Korean relations at the moment. And certainly all the movements that I've seen point towards there being a lot more provocations in the short to medium term future. So I don't know whether that necessarily plays out along the maritime border in the same way that it did under some previous presidents like Im Young-bak. But yeah, we'll have to see in the next few months when Yoon takes office how North Korea responds.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that is all that we have time for. I would like to thank our excellent panelists for joining us today, and thank you, the audience, for watching this La Trobe Asia launch event. This webinar has been recorded, and if you're registered for the event, you'll be emailed the appropriate links when they're ready. Please do check the La Trobe Asia website if you'd like a soft copy of edition 6 of our policy brief, or you can email us and we'll be happy to send you out a hard copy. Our next La Trobe Asia event is a hybrid event. We're very much looking forward to being able to meet in person. It's been a while for us. And that event is Deepening Australia-Japan Relations in a Contested Region. So you can sign up to that to attend that in person, or you can join us online, and that is at the La Trobe University City Campus, Monday, 4th of April at 3 p.m. AEDT. I'll be joined by Stephen Nagy, Nick Bisley and Kaori Okano, and we're going to be discussing the major strategic issues facing Australia and Japan in the region. So please follow us on Twitter at La Trobe Asia, or join our mailing list to find more details for online events and La Trobe Asia publications. But thank you again and have an excellent evening.
Thanks, Beck.